On the anniversary of his teammate's death, a former Navy SEAL returned to the cemetery, but still could not make himself walk all the way to the grave. Then an aging German shepherd appeared through the snow, carrying a single white flower in a worn cloth tube. The dog crossed the empty rows without searching, hesitation, or anyone guiding him. He placed the flower beside a grave most visitors passed without noticing. The Navy SEAL soon learned this was not the first forgotten name the dog had visited. For years, someone had been remembering the men whose families could no longer come, and the dog was still following the route alone. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. By the first week of December, the light over Montana had changed. It no longer fell warmly across the land. It hovered instead, thin, pale, and distant, above the high plateau outside Bozeman, where High Meadow Veterans Memorial Cemetery rested beneath a new layer of snow. The storm from the night before had not been violent. It had come quietly, softening the roads, covering the stone borders, and filling the shallow lettering on hundreds of bronze plaques. By afternoon, the clouds had loosened enough for the sun to pass through in silver bands. Wherever that light touched the snow, the ground glittered, as though something beneath it were trying to shine through. Graham Voss drove through the main gate at 3:17. He knew the time because he had checked the dashboard twice before turning in, although no one was waiting for him, and there was no appointment to miss. The heater in his truck made a faint clicking sound. He had been meaning to take the panel apart and inspect it for nearly a month. There was probably a loose relay behind the glove compartment, something small and measurable. Small problems were generous that way. They told a man what was wrong with them. Graham parked near the Navy Memorial and switched off the engine. For a moment, he remained behind the wheel. At 52, he still carried the broad shoulders and disciplined stillness of the man he had once been, though time had altered the edges. Silver had spread through the brown hair above his temples, and the lines between his brows no longer disappeared when he relaxed. His face was clean-shaven, angular, and controlled, the face of someone who had spent years learning not to show pain until the room was empty. He wore a dark field jacket over an olive combat shirt, its camouflage sleeves visible at the wrists. A steel coffee flask sat in the cup holder beside him. The dent near its base caught the weak light. The coffee inside had gone cold somewhere between Belgrade and the cemetery. Graham picked up the small folded flag from the passenger seat. Then he opened the door. The wind met him immediately, sliding beneath his collar and carrying the dry scent of snow, pine, and distant wood smoke. His boots sank lightly into the freshly cleared path. Damon Pike's grave stood 6 rows beyond the memorial wall. Graham knew the route without looking at the section markers. He had walked it enough times to remember every turn, though not often enough to call himself faithful. That difference mattered to him. Some years he came on Damon's birthday, some years on the anniversary. Once he had arrived in April, stood outside the line of cottonwoods for nearly 20 minutes, and left without approaching the grave at all. He told himself there were reasons: work, weather, a repair call near Helena, a bad knee that had not actually been bad that week. Grief, he had learned, could become remarkably inventive when asked to explain its absence. He stopped in front of the marker. Snow covered most of the bronze faceplate. Only the upper edge of Damon's name remained visible. Graham removed one glove and brushed the snow away with his bare hand. Damon Elias Pike. The letters appeared one at a time beneath his palm. United States Navy, below that the dates. Graham did not look at those for long. He placed the small flag into the frozen ground beside the marker, adjusting it twice until the staff stood straight. The flag moved gently in the wind, making a quiet fabric sound that seemed far too alive for the place. "I brought coffee," Graham said. His voice sounded unfamiliar in the open air. He looked down at the flask in his hand. "Not the way you drank it." Damon had believed sugar was less an ingredient than a challenge. Graham used to tell him he was drinking syrup with a rumor of coffee in it. There had been a time when that argument could fill 10 minutes. Now it filled nothing. Graham unscrewed the lid, but did not pour any out. He had never liked gestures that seemed designed for an audience, even when no audience existed. He was about to speak again when he noticed the flower. It lay partly buried beside the right corner of the grave, its stem protected beneath a thin sleeve of waxed paper. The petals were white, though the outer edges had browned slightly from the cold. The flower had been there before the last snowfall. Graham crouched and lifted it carefully. This was not the first time. Years earlier, he had found a small card tucked near the marker. The writing had blurred after a rain, leaving only the words "remembered" and "winter." Another time, there had been 2 white flowers laid across the lower edge of the stone. He had assumed Damon's mother left them, or perhaps someone from a veterans organization. High Meadow held ceremonies throughout the year. Volunteers placed flags, cleaned plaques, and replaced damaged wreaths. There were plenty of reasonable explanations. Graham had made certain not to test any of them. Asking who left the flowers would have meant admitting he did not know. Worse, it might have revealed that someone else had continued coming while he had stayed away. He placed the flower back where he had found it. The truth was not that Graham had forgotten Damon. The truth was that he remembered him everywhere, in the sharp smell of hydraulic fluid, in a badly tied fishing knot, in a particular laugh heard across a hardware store. At 2 a.m. when the house settled and the refrigerator motor shut off, leaving behind a silence large enough for old voices to enter. The cemetery was almost easier. Here Damon belonged to stone, snow, and engraved dates. Outside these gates, he remained unfinished. Graham rested one hand on the cold top of the marker. "I should have called your mother." The sentence emerged before he could stop it. He kept his hand there. "I said I would." A sound reached him from the road behind the rows. Not an engine, a measured clicking against ice. Graham turned. A German shepherd was moving between the white markers. The dog came from the direction of the eastern service path, walking without hurry. Snow clung to the dark saddle of his coat and gathered in the fur along his shoulders. His coloring was black and deep gold, with a pale mark at his chest that appeared briefly whenever he stepped into the light. One ear stood straight. The tip of the other curved slightly backward. In his mouth, the shepherd carried a narrow, waxed cloth tube. The white head of a flower rose from one end. Graham remained beside Damon's grave. The dog did not look lost. He did not search the rows or follow the scent of food. He passed a trash container near the maintenance lane without turning his head, and continued toward a cluster of older markers near the north path. His rear left leg landed a fraction later than the others. Not enough to slow him. Enough to notice. The shepherd reached a low wooden maintenance stake beside the path. Near it, half hidden under the snow, stood a shallow metal tray attached to a stone border. The dog lowered his head. He placed the cloth tube carefully into the tray. Then he sat. The wind lifted loose snow across the road between them. The shepherd's back remained straight. His head lowered, not in fear, but with a stillness so complete that Graham felt his own breathing change. There was nothing theatrical in the dog's posture. No trained salute. No human performance imposed upon an animal. He was simply waiting. For what? Graham could not tell. 30 seconds passed. Then another 30. Graham had stood through military memorials with rifles firing into gray skies, flags folded along sharp ceremonial lines, and officers speaking in voices polished by repetition. He had watched families hold themselves upright because collapsing in public felt like one more thing death had demanded of them. The dog's silence touched none of that ceremony. It felt older, more private. The shepherd finally raised his head. Instead of turning immediately towards the service gate, he looked across the rows at Graham. His eyes were a dark amber. Graham expected caution, perhaps hunger. What he found was simple attention. The dog saw him. That was all. Yet for one brief and uncomfortable moment, Graham felt as though he had been discovered doing something he had spent years hiding. Not grieving, but withholding grief, preserving it like a debt that must never be paid. The shepherd stood and walked away. He did not approach Damon's grave. He did not ask Graham to follow. Within moments, he passed behind a line of spruce trees and disappeared toward the eastern path. A maintenance cart hummed in the distance. Graham looked down again at the flower beside Damon's name. For the first time, he wondered whether it had arrived by the same route. The cart rounded the bend slowly, its tires crunching over treated snow. The woman driving wore a dark green cemetery jacket and a charcoal turtleneck. Her black hair, streaked with silver, had been cut into a short bob that moved against her jaw in the wind. She stopped several yards away and switched off the cart. "You're Graham Voss," she said. It was not a question. Graham straightened. "We met once. 3 years ago," the woman said. "You reported a loose hinge on the memorial flag case. You remembered that? I remember hinges people report before they break." She stepped down from the cart. Her badge read, "Nora Price, Cemetery Manager." Up close, she had the composed expression of someone accustomed to making decisions that satisfied no one completely. Graham glanced toward the trees. "That dog belonged to the cemetery?" "Not exactly." Lenora followed his gaze. "His name is Tully. He belonged to Arthur Crow, our former head groundskeeper." "Belonged?" "Arthur died last January." The answer settled into the space between them. Lenora explained that Arthur had adopted Tully from a rescue station several years earlier. The dog had accompanied him on late-day inspections after burials ended and most visitors had gone home. Arthur had trained Tully to follow 4 fixed routes through the grounds. The flowers were taken only to designated memorial points near service paths, never directly through active burial areas. "His wife still prepares them," Lenora said. "Evelyn Crow. She lives in the old groundskeeper's house beyond the east gate." Graham looked toward the north section. "And you allow it?" "For now." There was no defensiveness in her voice, only precision. "Tully's still registered under Arthur's employee companion permit. Evelyn keeps his veterinary records current. He uses the service gate after the last scheduled burial. I've extended the arrangement month by month." "Why?" Lenora glanced toward the tray where Tully had left the flower. "Because he has never approached a family, damaged a marker, or ignored a closed route." That was not the full answer, and both of them knew it. Graham did not press. Lenora looked beyond the rows toward the northern slope. Several sections there had been marked with thin orange survey stakes. "The county engineer is coming tomorrow," she said. "The hillside has moved again." Graham followed her line of sight. From where he stood, the ground appeared normal beneath the snow. "Moved how much?" "Enough to lift part of the access path. Freeze-thaw cycles are pushing water beneath the surface. If the engineer confirms what we suspect, the older north section may close until spring." Graham looked towards the trees where Tully had disappeared. "Does one of his routes go through there?" "2 of them." The answer bothered him more than it should have. He looked back at Damon's marker, at the browned edges of the white flower. "This isn't my concern." Lenora did not argue. She walked closer to the grave, but stopped at a respectful distance. Arthur called this row the quiet line. Graham's face tightened. Why? Not because the men here were quiet. Her gaze settled on the markers extending beyond Damon's. Because fewer people came to speak their names. The small flag beside Damon moved again. Graham picked up his coffee flask. Lenora returned to the maintenance cart without asking him another question. The engine started, then faded slowly towards the administration building. Graham stayed for another minute. He had brought words with him. He had rehearsed them in the truck, in the shower, once, while standing alone in the equipment workshop with a broken radio open beneath his hands. None of those words came. Instead, he adjusted the white flower so it rested beside the flag. "I'll come back," he said. He did not know whether the promise was for Damon or himself. The snow had begun falling more heavily when Graham drove through the cemetery gate. Near the eastern fence, he saw a line of paw prints crossing the untouched ground. They entered through a narrow service opening and continued toward the dark trees beyond the property. Graham slowed his truck. The prints remained visible for only a short distance before the snowfall softened their edges. He drove on. At the first intersection, the road divided, one direction leading back toward Bozeman, the other following the cemetery fence toward the eastern woods. Graham turned toward home. But his foot eased from the accelerator before the truck completed the turn. The next afternoon, Graham returned to High Meadow with a reason prepared in advance. He wanted to ask Lenora who had placed the flower beside Damon's grave. It was a reasonable question. Practical. Limited. It did not explain why he arrived shortly before 4, parked where he could see the eastern service gate, and remained in his truck after the engine had gone quiet. The sky was brighter than the day before. Sunlight moved beneath the clouds in long, pale strips, turning the snowfields beyond the cemetery fence almost blue. Wind had erased part of the tire marks along the service lane, but the paths inside the grounds remained clear. Graham set his dented coffee flask in the cup holder and watched the gate. At 4:12, Tully appeared. The German shepherd came through the narrow opening beneath the maintenance rail with a small waxed cloth carrier in his mouth. A square piece of cedar hung from its cord, striking softly against the tube as he walked. Tully saw Graham immediately. One ear remained straight while the bent tip of the other shifted towards the truck. He paused, body angled between the road and the trees. Graham opened the door and stepped out. He did not call the dog. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Tully turned away and started along the outer service path. It was not an invitation. Graham understood that much. It was also not a refusal. He followed at a distance wide enough that Tully never had to look back twice. The path ran beside the cemetery fence, before bending into a stand of lodgepole pines. Snow rested heavily on the lower branches, dropping in small, soft collapses whenever the wind moved through. Tully knew where the ice collected. He left the main track twice, choosing patches of packed earth beneath the trees. Graham noticed the dog's rear legs stiffen on the incline. Tully shortened one stride, adjusted, and continued. There was no urgency in the journey. That made Graham feel more intrusive, not less. He had followed people before under circumstances where being seen could cost lives. He had learned how to match another person's speed without entering the edge of their awareness. None of that training seemed honorable here. This was not surveillance. It was a man walking behind a dog because asking a direct question had begun to feel harder than crossing a frozen field. The old groundskeeper's house appeared beyond the pines. It was smaller than Graham expected, a single-story timber home with a shallow porch, a stone chimney, and a narrow workshop attached to one side. The roof had been cleared recently, but snow had gathered again along the lower eaves. A metal bucket stood near the porch rail beneath a folded wool blanket. The heads of several white flowers rose from beneath it. 4 cloth carriers hung from separate hooks beside the door. Each had its own marker: a round pine disc, a square of cedar, a strip of blue fabric, and a small brass bell no larger than a thumbnail. Tully climbed the steps and set his carrier beside the square-marked hook. Before Graham reached the porch, the dog sneezed twice. The front door opened. The woman standing there was small enough that Graham initially noticed the cane before he noticed her expression. Evelyn Crow had silver-white hair gathered into a low knot at the back of her neck. A burgundy cardigan was buttoned over a cream blouse, and one hand rested firmly on a dark wooden cane. Her face was lined but alert, with pale brown eyes that seemed to reach conclusions faster than politeness allowed. She looked at Tully first, then at Graham. "Tully says we have company," she said. "His system is very advanced. 2 sneezes for a stranger, 1 for the mail carrier. Continuous dramatic suffering when someone brings him the wrong biscuits." Tully sat beside the door. Graham removed his cap. "Graham Voss." "I know." He waited. Evelyn leaned slightly on the cane. "Lenora called this morning. She said a tall man in a military shirt had started asking questions with his face instead of his mouth." "That sounds like Lenora." "It sounded like Arthur." The name changed the air between them, though Evelyn's expression did not. Graham glanced at the carriers beside the door. "I wanted to ask about the flowers. Most people knock first." He looked at the open door. "You opened it." "That was not the same as inviting you in." A small movement touched one corner of her mouth. Then she stepped aside. "Wipe your boots. Arthur spent 22 years keeping mud out of this house, and death has not made him less opinionated." The warmth inside carried the scent of dark coffee, cedar shavings, and old wool. Nothing in the house looked abandoned. That was the first thing Graham noticed. A pair of heavy groundskeeping boots stood beside the wall, as though their owner might return before supper. A dark coat hung from a peg near the kitchen. On the table beneath the window sat an open metal toolbox, its compartments filled with screws, hinge pins, twine, and sharpened carpenter's pencils. The objects did not form a shrine. They had simply not yet learned they were no longer in use. Tully walked past Graham and settled near the wood stove. He did not lie down completely. His chest remained lifted, eyes moving between Evelyn and the visitor. Evelyn pointed toward a chair at the kitchen table. Graham sat. She poured coffee from an enamel pot into a cream-colored mug and set it in front of him. The faded words on the side read, "Head groundskeeper's boss." He took one careful sip. The coffee was strong enough to make his jaw tighten. Evelyn watched him. "Too weak?" "No." Arthur used to say that with the same expression. Graham placed the mug down. On the far end of the table lay a thick ledger bound in dark green cloth. Several fabric tabs protruded from its pages. Evelyn followed his gaze. "That is what you came to see, though you probably planned to pretend otherwise for another 10 minutes. I came to ask who left the flower at Damon Pike's grave." "Arthur did, for years." The answer arrived without ceremony. Graham sat still. "And now?" "Sometimes I send one. Sometimes Lenora places it when the weather is too bad for Tully. Yesterday's was from me." Graham looked towards the dog. "Tully didn't take it?" "Not yesterday. His leg was stiff in the morning." As though hearing himself discussed, Tully shifted his weight and rested his chin across his front paws. Evelyn opened the ledger. "Arthur never taught him hundreds of graves. People like to improve dead men's stories until they become miracles." She turned the book so Graham could see. A hand-drawn map divided the cemetery into 4 broad routes. Each was marked with the same symbols as the carriers outside. The square cedar marker is the north path. The round pine marker follows the eastern memorial wall. Blue cloth is the navy section. The bell marks the older western plots. Graham studied the map. Each symbol means one grave, one cluster. Tully follows the path and stops at the same memorial point Arthur used. We choose the name for the day from the section. The flower is placed at the shared marker or the nearest approved tray. So he doesn't find an individual name. He finds a route. There was satisfaction in Evelyn's correction, but not defensiveness. Arthur walked those paths with him hundreds of times. Tully remembers turns, surfaces, tree lines, and scent markers. Snow causes trouble. So do machines. Once a grounds crew brought in a track loader, and Tully returned with the flower still in his mouth. Sat under this table for 2 hours and refused to look at Arthur. Graham looked down. Tully's eyes were now closed. He's afraid of heavy equipment? The low vibration. Metal striking metal. We do not know what happened before the rescue station found him. Evelyn's fingers rested on the edge of the ledger. Arthur never believed love gave him permission to force the dog through fear. If Tully would not go, Arthur carried the flower himself. The statement reached Graham more directly than he expected. He looked back at the 4 routes. On the page beside the map, names had been arranged beneath dates and section numbers. Some entries included only a line or 2. Others contained notes written in 2 different hands. Graham recognized Evelyn's neat, compact script. Arthur's writing leaned forward, uneven but deliberate. Evelyn turned several pages. Arthur gathered what families chose to share: obituaries, service organizations, conversations at the gate, nothing private unless people gave permission. She touched one entry. Harold Brenner repaired upright pianos after leaving the army, could tune one by ear but never learned to drive. Another page. Margaret Cho loved jazz and disliked lilies. Her sister said she considered them funeral flowers, which is unfortunate under the circumstances. Graham almost smiled. Evelyn noticed, but let the moment pass. A third entry described a former medic who kept peppermint candies in every coat he owned. Taped beneath the paragraph was an empty wrapper, flattened carefully. Then came the pages with less. A name, a date, a service branch, no family notes, no remembered habit, no story about coffee, music, or broken cars. Arthur had written beneath one of them. No one left to provide details. Remember the name anyway. Graham read the sentence twice. He had expected sentiment, something polished enough to place on a plaque. The bluntness unsettled him more. Evelyn turned another page. Damon Elias Pike appeared beneath the blue fabric tab. Graham's hand tightened slightly around the coffee mug. The entry contained Damon's date of birth, service information, and burial location. Beneath those were smaller notes. Born in Wyoming. Mother later moved to Bozeman, preferred winter fishing. Sunday calls home when duty allowed. Coffee, excessive sugar. The last line had been underlined once. Graham stared at it. That was accurate, he said. I assumed so. Damon's mother told Arthur. Some of it. Some came from an obituary. A few details Arthur picked up from people who visited. Graham looked farther down the page. There was no mention of the mission, no account of the manner of Damon's death. Arthur had recorded the life around it instead. Why this grave? Graham asked. Evelyn did not pretend to misunderstand. Why did Arthur keep placing flowers there? Yes. She closed the ledger halfway, leaving one finger between the pages. Because he saw you. Graham's expression changed. Evelyn continued before he could speak. Not often. A few times over several years. Once by the cottonwoods, once near the road. You stood where you could see the marker but did not approach it. The room seemed suddenly smaller. You knew who I was? No, Arthur did not either. Not then. And he discussed me with you. He said there was a man who came carrying grief like it was classified information. Graham looked away from her. Outside the kitchen window, wind loosened snow from the porch roof. It slid down in a soft white sheet. He remembered the April visit. He had driven nearly 90 miles after a service call, parked beyond the office, and walked as far as the trees. Damon's mother had been at the grave. Graham had seen her gray coat from the road. He had left before she could see him. At the time, he had called it respect. Later, he called it cowardice. Now he discovered that a man he had never met had noticed the difference. I didn't ask him to watch me. No. I didn't need someone leaving flowers because I couldn't walk across a cemetery. Evelyn's gaze remained steady. Arthur did not leave them because he thought you were incapable. Then why? Because Damon was still there on the days you were not. The words were not unkind. That made them harder to resist. Graham stood and moved toward the window. His coffee remained on the table. Below the glass, the 4 carriers waited beside the porch. Ordinary fabric, wooden markers, waxed seams. Nothing about them asked to become a symbol. Behind him, Evelyn reopened the ledger. Arthur never walked out to you, she said. He never called your name. He never asked you to explain why you stayed near the trees. Graham kept his back to her. He believed kindness could become vanity if the giver needed to be seen doing it. The wood stove gave a small metallic tick as it cooled. Graham looked toward Tully. The dog had raised his head. He was watching Evelyn, not Graham. The chapter's strangest realization came quietly. Tully had not led him here to reveal anything. The dog had simply gone home. Graham had chosen to follow. The distinction mattered. A telephone rang on the wall beside the refrigerator. Evelyn reached for it before the second ring. Hello, Diane? Her voice changed. Not softer, exactly, but guarded in a different direction. Graham returned to the table and closed the ledger enough to give her privacy, without pretending not to hear. Yes, the nurse came yesterday. A pause. No, I did not forget. Another pause, longer. The road is clear. Tully stood and moved beside Evelyn's chair. Graham watched the dog place his shoulder lightly against her knee. Evelyn's mouth tightened. I am not coming to Missoula every time the forecast includes snow. We live in Montana. That would be most of the year. Her daughter's voice rose faintly through the receiver, too distant for words. Evelyn looked toward the darkened porch window. I know what happened to Mrs. Halpern. I am not Mrs. Halpern. Another pause. No, Diane. I understand what ice is. Tully remained pressed against her leg. Graham could see the argument from both sides without knowing either woman well enough to deserve an opinion. Diane heard danger in an old house beside a cemetery. Evelyn heard erasure. The conversation ended without agreement. Evelyn returned the receiver to the wall and kept her hand there for a moment. She believes concern becomes wisdom if repeated loudly enough. She may be worried. Evelyn turned. Do former Navy SEALs receive specialized training in stating the obvious? Advanced course. That earned him the smallest laugh. Tully relaxed and returned to the stove. Graham glanced toward the ledger. Does Diane want you to move? She wants me near her during storms. That isn't the same thing. It becomes the same thing one overnight bag at a time. Her tone was dry, but the hand resting on the cane had tightened. Graham did not tell her what to do. He had spent too many years mistaking action for authority. Instead, he looked toward the front window and noticed the porch light remained dark, though the afternoon had begun to fade. "Your light's out." Evelyn followed his gaze. "Yes." "You have another bulb?" "In the workshop." She studied him for a moment. "I was told you repair rescue equipment." "I do." "Do you think that experience qualifies you for a porch bulb, or should we notify the county?" Graham picked up his jacket. The replacement bulb was stored in Arthur's workshop beside labeled drawers of fasteners and lengths of electrical wire wound into exact circles. The fixture itself was old but sound. Moisture had entered around the lower seal and corroded one contact. Graham cleaned it, replaced the bulb, and tightened the gasket. When he switched the power back on, warm yellow light spread across the porch. Snowflakes moved through it slowly. Tully lay on the lower step with his front paws crossed, watching Graham work. His bent ear shifted every time a tool touched metal. Graham lowered the screwdriver. "You've got opinions." Tully blinked. From the doorway, Evelyn said, "He thinks you use too much pressure on the housing. He can fix the next one. He has no thumbs. It is the only reason Arthur remained employed." Graham packed the tools. The square cedar marker still hung from the carrier Tully had returned. Tomorrow, it would likely hold another flower, another name, another small duty belonging to people Graham had never known. He stepped off the porch. Evelyn remained in the doorway with one hand on her cane. "You came to ask who left Damon's flower," she said. "I got an answer." "No, you got several facts. Answers usually take longer." Graham put on his cap. He did not argue. As he crossed the yard, the new porch light cast his shadow ahead of him. Tully stayed on the step, his expression solemn enough to suggest Graham had barely passed inspection. At the tree line, Graham looked back. Evelyn had gone inside, but the light remained on above the door. Beneath it hung the 4 empty carriers, turning slightly in the cold air. The blue strip marking the navy route caught the wind and lifted once before settling again. Over the next 2 weeks, Graham found reasons to return to the house beside the service gate. The first reason was the porch rail. One of the lower bolts had loosened where winter moisture had swollen the wood. Graham replaced it with a galvanized fastener and added a narrow support beneath the top board. The second reason was the rear step. Its outer edge had softened enough to flex under Evelyn's weight. Graham removed the damaged plank, cut a replacement in Arthur's workshop, and sealed it before fitting it into place. The third reason was the generator. That one was legitimate. The fuel line showed early cracking near the coupling, and the battery terminals had gathered enough corrosion to make cold starts unreliable. After that, the reasons became less convincing. A drawer in the kitchen stuck when the air turned damp. The weather stripping along the back door had pulled loose. A brass hook beside the entry leaned 3 degrees lower than the others. Evelyn noticed the change before Graham admitted it to himself. "You are running out of broken things," she said one afternoon. She stood at the counter with one hand braced against the edge while coffee darkened inside the enamel pot. "I can check the smoke detectors. You checked them Tuesday. The carbon monoxide detector. Wednesday. The attic vent. That one was Thursday, and you frightened a squirrel into retirement." Graham accepted the mug she handed him. The coffee was darker than the inside of the stove. He took a sip and stared into it. "If you poured this over the cemetery," he said, "half the people out there would ask for 5 more minutes." Evelyn sat across from him. At least the dead appreciate coffee made with conviction. Tully lay between the table and the wood stove, His body turned toward the front door. He had stopped watching Graham's hands every time they moved, though he still kept one ear angled in his direction. Trust, Graham had discovered, did not arrive like a door opening. It arrived like an animal no longer leaving the room. On colder days, Tully allowed Graham to walk beside him for part of the flower route. The dog preferred Graham on his right, away from the stiff rear leg. If Graham moved ahead, Tully slowed. If he crowded too close from behind, the bent ear flattened briefly until Graham gave him space. They had completed 2 of the shorter routes without trouble. On the third, Tully stopped before they reached the cemetery fence. The morning temperature had fallen sharply. Snow had hardened into a thin crust, and the dog's left rear leg did not bend fully when he stepped. Tully stood beneath the pines with the waxed cloth carrier in his mouth. He shifted his weight once, tried another step, then lowered the carrier into the snow. Graham waited. "Easy," he said. Tully looked toward the service gate, then toward the house. He made no attempt to continue. Graham had known men who would press through pain until damage became permanent, because stopping felt too much like surrender. He had been one of them. He picked up the carrier. Tully did not resist. The dog returned to Evelyn, while Graham completed the eastern route alone. The flower that day belonged to Lewis Harmon, an army mechanic whose surviving family lived 3 states away. His designated memorial point stood near a low stone wall where snow gathered in smooth drifts. Graham placed the flower in the tray. Nothing happened. No music rose. No revelation arrived. The name remained a name he had not known that morning. Yet as Graham walked back, he found himself repeating it. Lewis Harmon. Once aloud. Once silently. That, he realized, might have been the whole purpose. Several days later, Tully failed another route for a different reason. A county road crew had brought a track excavator through the North Service entrance. The machine was not operating near the house, but the low pulse of its engine traveled through the frozen ground. Tully heard it before Graham did. The dog stopped in the yard, his head lowered, and the waxed cloth tube slipped from his mouth. A metal bucket struck the excavator's side in the distance. Tully turned sharply and moved toward the porch. He did not bark or run wildly. He simply left. Evelyn opened the door before he reached it. Tully crossed the threshold and disappeared beneath the kitchen table. Graham looked toward the service road. "They're half a mile away." "To you," Evelyn said. She lowered herself carefully into a chair and held one hand near the floor without reaching beneath the table. Arthur's old navy scarf hung on the chair beside her. Graham lifted it without thinking, intending to move it out of the way. Tully's head appeared immediately. The dog backed deeper beneath the table, his eyes fixed on Graham's hand. Graham stopped. The scarf was faded, soft from years of wear, with one frayed corner that had been repaired by dark thread. He returned it to the chair. Tully continued watching him. "Arthur wore that on the late routes," Evelyn said. "Tully does not like anyone taking it from behind him." "I wasn't taking it." "The dog does not have access to your intentions." Graham lowered his hand. After a moment, Tully rested his chin on the floor again. The route was cancelled. Evelyn did not ask Graham to carry the flower. The excavation noise would continue into the afternoon, and the path crossed close enough to the work zone that Lenora had already marked it temporarily closed. The flower remained in its bucket until the next morning. That unsettled Graham more than he expected. He had begun to think of the roots as promises. A missed promise felt like failure. Evelyn did not share the urgency. "Arthur missed days," she said. "Snowstorms, burials, his bad back, Tully's fear. The names did not disappear because one flower stayed home." Then why keep the schedule? Because a habit can hold people together. She looked toward Tully beneath the table. But the habit is not more important than the people holding it. Graham understood the words. Accepting them was different. 2 days later, Lenora called and asked him to meet at the north section. The county engineer had completed the first survey. Graham arrived shortly after noon and found 3 orange stakes driven into the snow beside the access road. Thin cord connected them in a crooked line. A man in a slate-blue technical jacket stood near the slope, with one boot pressed against the edge of the pavement. He was a little shorter than Graham, lean rather than heavily built, with closely cropped black hair and a few silver strands at the front. A white, hard hat rested beneath one arm. "This is Calvin Rusk," Lenora said, "County Geotechnical Engineer." Calvin offered a gloved hand. "Lenora tells me you have concerns about access. She tells people a lot." "She does. It saves time." There was no challenge in Calvin's tone. He spoke as though facts did not become less useful when delivered plainly. He led Graham and Lenora along the north path. At first, the ground appeared stable. Snow covered the edges evenly, and the headstones beyond the road stood straight. Then Calvin stopped beside a seam in the pavement. "Kick the snow away." Graham used the side of his boot. A crack ran across the path beneath the white crust. On the downhill edge, one slab had risen nearly 3 inches above the next. 76 millimeters, Calvin said. "A little under 3 inches. The shift happened after the last thaw." He pointed toward the slope. "Water enters beneath the path, freezes, expands, and moves the fill. When it warms, the support settles unevenly. That cycle has repeated enough times to affect the retaining layer." Graham looked toward the memorial rows. "You can stabilize it?" "Yes." "How long?" Calvin glanced at the sky before answering. "Not safely during active freeze conditions. We can reduce drainage now, monitor movement, and reinforce in spring." "That leaves half the old section closed." "Closer to 30%. 2 of Tully's routes." Calvin nodded. "I read the notes." Graham looked at Lenora. "You put the dog in the engineering report?" "I put every regular use of the area in the access assessment." Calvin walked farther and stopped near a shallow depression beside the road. "The visible crack is not the main concern." He pushed a metal probe through the snow. The rod sank unexpectedly deep before meeting resistance. "There is a void under part of this shoulder. If someone steps here and the crust gives way, the fall may only be 2 feet. But an older visitor can break a hip in less." Graham stared down at the undisturbed snow. It looked harmless. That was the part he disliked most. A threat should have the decency to appear threatening. "Could build a controlled walkway," he said. "Temporary panels, marked edges. In the green zone, perhaps. And here? No." The answer came without hesitation. Graham's jaw tightened. "We are talking about people carrying flowers, not moving heavy equipment." Calvin met his gaze. "The ground does not distinguish between a good reason and a bad one." Lenora folded her arms. "From January 1st, the red zone closes completely. No staff, no visitors, no volunteers, no dog." Graham looked across the rows toward a distant tray, half buried beside a stone border. "So a fence and a report decide who gets remembered?" "No," Lenora said. "They decide where people are allowed to fall." "That's convenient." Calvin's expression did not change, but something cooled in it. "You think I am protecting paperwork?" "I think systems are good at turning neglect into procedure." Calvin removed his hard hat from beneath his arm and placed it on his head. Then he stepped off the pavement. Lenora started to speak, but he raised one hand. He moved only a few feet into the marked shoulder before stopping. With the toe of his boot, He pressed the snow. The surface held. He pressed again, harder. A section collapsed beneath him with a dull sound. One leg dropped almost to the knee before he caught himself against the probe. Snow slid into a narrow cavity hidden underneath. Calvin climbed back onto the road. "If Mrs. Crow stepped there," he said, brushing ice from his trouser leg, "kindness would not keep her femur intact." The demonstration angered Graham because it was effective. Lenora looked at him. Kindness is not exempt from gravity. For several seconds, no one spoke. Wind moved across the slope and carried loose snow through the orange cord. Graham looked at the collapsed shoulder. He had entered dangerous places for causes he believed were worth the risk. He had also ordered other men not to follow him, because courage did not make their bodies replaceable. Yet here, faced with rules he had not designed, he had instinctively treated caution as weakness. He had reduced Lenora to an administrator and Calvin to an obstacle, because that was easier than admitting the problem might not yield to force. Calvin pulled the orange cord tighter. "We will map a green route," he said. "You can keep the accessible memorial points active. The names from the red zone will need another location until spring." "Another location isn't the same." "No," Calvin said, "but neither is a hospital room." The meeting ended without agreement, though the decision itself was final. That evening, Graham found Diane's SUV outside Evelyn's house. The road had been cleared earlier, leaving high banks of snow along both sides of the drive. Diane stood in the kitchen wearing a navy coat she had not removed, a brown leather tote on the table beside her. She had Evelyn's eyes but a squarer jaw, and a way of holding herself as though the next task had already become late. Evelyn sat with the green ledger closed beneath one hand. Tully stood between them. "I am not asking you to move permanently," Diane said. "I am asking you to stay with me when the next storm comes." "And after that storm?" "You come home." "And the one after that?" "We decide when it happens." That is how houses become places people used to live. Diane exhaled and looked toward Graham. He had entered at the wrong moment and knew it. "Mr. Voss," she said, "would you tell her the steps are unsafe?" "I repaired the steps. That was not the question." Evelyn pushed her chair back. "I need the ledger." "It's under your hand," Diane said. "The route ledger, the smaller one." She began to stand. Her right knee gave slightly. It was not a dramatic fall. It was a brief loss of support, the kind a person might hide by reaching for the table and pretending to have intended the movement. Tully moved before anyone else. He stepped across Evelyn's legs and pressed his shoulder against her knees. His body became a brace until she steadied herself. Graham reached the chair, but stopped once he saw Tully had already held her upright. Diane's face lost its anger. "Mom, I am fine. You almost fell." "I did not. Because the dog caught you." Tully remained against Evelyn. She reached for the blue cloth flower carrier hanging beside the back door. "Come on, Tully." The dog did not move. Evelyn touched the carrier to his collar. Tully turned his head away and leaned more firmly against her knees. He did not understand the dispute over Missoula or the future of the house. He had simply felt Evelyn lose balance and had decided she should not stand alone. Graham took the carrier from her hand. "I'll do it." Evelyn looked up at him. "The Navy route?" "I know it." Diane started to object. Graham glanced toward her. "It stays in the green zone." That mattered. Calvin's map was already folded inside Graham's jacket. He left before either woman could turn his decision into an argument. The route crossed the central avenue and followed the public path toward the Navy section. Snow had begun falling in small, dry grains. Graham carried the flower rather than using Tully's cloth tube. The stem felt too delicate in his gloved hand, so he held it inside the waxed carrier. Near the lower row, he noticed an older man sitting on a folding stool beside a grave. The man wore a brick-red barn jacket, a burnt orange cap, and a silver mustache broad enough to collect snow. A large red thermos stood beside his boot. He watched Graham approach. "Dog finally hired help?" he asked. Graham stopped. "Excuse me?" "I've seen that shepherd make this route. Figured management would eventually give him an assistant." Graham looked at the carrier. "Salary hasn't been discussed. That's how they get you." The man rose with a small grunt and folded the stool. "Miles Kincaid." "Graham Voss." Miles nodded toward the grave behind him. "My wife, June. She believed any conversation could be improved by telling me what I was doing wrong. Was she usually right?" "Cruelly." They walked together toward the designated memorial point. Miles did not ask why Graham carried the flower. Instead, he spoke about the weather, the poor quality of the cemetery vending machine, and a snow shovel he claimed had been designed by a person with deep personal hatred for backs. At the tray, Graham placed the flower. Miles removed his cap. They stood quietly for a few seconds. On the return path, Miles said, "I come here most afternoons." "To visit your wife?" "That too." Graham glanced at him. Miles pushed both hands into his coat pockets. "My house gets loud when no one's in it." The line sounded contradictory until Graham understood. A refrigerator motor, heating pipes, floorboards, all the ordinary sounds that grew larger when there was no second person to hear them. Miles looked toward the administration building. "Here, someone eventually drives past. Lenora waves. Grounds crew complains. That dog judges everybody equally." Graham looked back at the flower resting in the snow. He had spent 2 weeks thinking about lonely graves. It had not occurred to him that some of the people visiting them came because the cemetery was the only place where their own absence might be noticed. At the service gate, Miles turned toward the western rows. "Tell the dog I expect my application to be reviewed fairly." "I'll mention it." "You do that." Graham continued toward Evelyn's house alone. The porch light he had repaired glowed through the falling snow. Behind the window, 3 figures moved through the kitchen. Evelyn, Diane, and Tully positioned close to both of them. Graham stopped outside with the empty carrier in his hand. The cemetery behind him held hundreds of people who could no longer be lonely. The house in front of him held 3 who were still learning how not to be. 3 days before the north section was scheduled to close, Lenora asked for help clearing the old records shed. The building sat behind the maintenance garage, close enough to the unstable slope that Calvin had marked its rear wall with orange paint. Anything worth preserving had to be moved before the final barrier went up. Graham arrived shortly after 8 with his truck, a folding handcart, 2 moving blankets, and the quiet determination of a man who preferred lifting boxes to discussing why they mattered. The morning was bright and bitterly cold. Sunlight reflected off the snow with such force that the windows of the shed appeared white from a distance. Inside, the air smelled of dust, cardboard, dry wood, and the faint mineral scent of old stone. Shelves lined 3 walls. Some held maintenance logs and maps. Others were filled with narrow archival boxes labeled by cemetery section, year, or service branch. A woman stood at a folding table beneath the only window. She wore a teal sweater beneath a wool coat, fingerless gloves, and round, reddish-brown glasses. Her silver hair had been cut in a soft pixie style that left one side slightly longer than the other. She was small, but the table around her had been arranged with the authority of a field command post. 3 pencils lay parallel beside a blue fountain pen. A stack of index cards had been divided into categories marked Verified, Family Source, Public Record, and Needs Review. Without looking up, she said, "The boxes with red cotton ties remain upright." Graham stopped with one hand on the nearest carton. "I wasn't planning to turn them upside down. People rarely plan archival damage." She adjusted her glasses and looked at him. "You must be Graham Voss." He had become used to strangers knowing his name before introductions. "Lenora called?" "Evelyn did." That answer carried different weight. The woman offered her hand. "Naomi Bell. I helped Arthur with the Memorial Archive." Graham shook it. "You're the one who organized the ledger?" The ledger was Evelyn's system. Arthur's system was to place useful paper in whatever container had room and then insist he knew where everything was. A faint smile softened Naomi's mouth. "He did, unfortunately. It encouraged him." She handed Graham a clipboard, listing the order in which the boxes needed to be moved. The work began without ceremony. Graham transported maintenance files and framed maps to the administration building. Naomi inspected every archival box before allowing it onto the cart. If the lid had warped or the binding had weakened, she replaced it on the spot. Arthur's memorial cards occupied most of the western shelves. There were hundreds of them. Some had photographs attached. Others contained clipped obituaries, handwritten notes, photocopied letters, or small slips of paper bearing the name of a visitor who had supplied a detail. Nothing about the collection looked secret. Its incompleteness was visible everywhere. A card might list a favorite song, but no surviving relative. Another carried a date of birth with a question mark beside the town. Some notes had been crossed out after family members corrected them. Others were stamped unconfirmed and set aside. Graham lifted one box carefully. "I thought these were all in the ledger." Naomi shook her head. "The ledger holds route information. This is the archive Arthur hoped to digitize." "He wrote all of this?" "Most of it. Evelyn added some. I standardized the sources and dates." She selected a card from the table. Arthur collected public obituaries, family submissions, approved Veteran Association records, and things visitors told him directly. If a story could not be verified, it stayed marked as uncertain. So he didn't know every person buried here. No one could. Naomi returned the card to its sleeve. Arthur never confused remembering with pretending. Graham read the top card in the box he was holding. The entry described a Navy cook who had disliked onions, raised greyhounds after retirement, and once mailed the same birthday card to his sister 3 years in a row because he kept forgetting he had already sent it. The details were ordinary. That was what gave them force. Graham carried the box to the truck. By mid-morning, they had cleared 2 shelves. Lenora passed through twice to check progress, then left to supervise installation of the first barrier near the red zone. The shed became quieter after she was gone. Naomi worked with the concentration of someone repairing a fragile machine, 1 page at a time. She did not fill the silence simply because another person occupied it. Graham appreciated that. He was wrapping an old section map in a moving blanket when Naomi asked, "Did Damon Pike drink coffee with 6 sugars or 7? The map slipped slightly in his hands. He caught it before it struck the floor. "Depends on the size of the cup." Naomi glanced toward a box marked Navy, Section C. "I thought you might know." Graham set the map down. "Why?" His name came up when Evelyn called. There was no dramatic pause in her voice, no suggestion that she had uncovered something intended to change his life. She walked to the shelf and removed a narrow box tied with faded blue cord. "Arthur kept the Navy cards together until I could finish scanning them." Naomi placed the box on the table and untied the cord. Her fingers moved slowly, not from age but care. Every card had a protective sleeve. Small source labels had been affixed to the lower corners. She found Damon's name near the back. "Before you read this," she said, "the official information came from the cemetery file, public service records available to us, his obituary, and notes provided by his mother." Graham looked at the card, but did not take it. "What else?" "One personal observation from Arthur, clearly marked." That was enough to make him uneasy. Naomi held the card out. Graham accepted it. The front contained Damon's full name, service information, and burial location. Beneath it were shorter notes written in Arthur's forward-leaning hand. Born in Wyoming. Mother relocated to Bozeman after husband's death. Attended college in Montana before enlistment. Preferred ice fishing. Called home Sundays when possible. Coffee contained enough sugar to qualify as dessert. Graham's thumb stopped beside the final line. "That sounds like him." I assumed Arthur was being conservative. Despite himself, Graham released a brief breath that almost became a laugh. The sound faded quickly. The card did not mention the operation in which Damon died. It did not describe medals, heroism, or the official sequence of events. It preserved the parts no military record considered important. The calls home, the fishing, the ruined coffee. Graham turned the card slightly. A second note had been attached to the back. The paper was smaller, cut unevenly from a maintenance pad. It was dated many years before Damon's burial. Arthur had written, "Met Pike and Voss during memorial detail for Pike's uncle." Pike talked it enough for both men, asked why Voss kept himself at the outside edge of the group. Pike said, "He can get anybody out of a bad place. Never learned how to get himself out." Graham read the sentence again. For a moment, the shed disappeared. He saw a different winter, years earlier, before the final mission. Damon was younger, broader through the shoulders, standing badly at attention because he had never learned to keep humor from reaching his face. They had volunteered for the memorial detail during leave because Damon's mother had asked him to help with his uncle's service. Graham remembered Arthur now. Not clearly, only as an older groundskeeper carrying folding chairs and speaking quietly to Damon near the flag stand. He had not known they discussed him. The note continued. After Pike burial, recognized Voss as the man who sometimes watches from cottonwoods. Do not approach unless invited. Let the flower do the part conversation might damage. Graham's grip tightened on the sleeve. Naomi saw it. "That note was not in the public file," she said. "Arthur kept personal observations separate." "He watched me. He noticed you." "That's a generous word for it." Naomi removed her glasses and cleaned one lens with the corner of a cloth. "He did not record where you lived. He did not ask Lenora to identify you. He did not contact anyone." "He wrote about me." "Yes." Graham placed the card on the table more sharply than he intended. The blue fountain pen rolled half an inch. "I never asked Damon to explain me to strangers. No. I never asked Arthur to decide what I needed. No." Naomi's agreement made the anger harder to direct. Graham paced once toward the shelves and back. The shed was too narrow for the movement he wanted. Damon had turned him into a sentence. Arthur had kept the sentence. Evelyn had sent flowers. Now Naomi stood there offering the whole arrangement as though it might be kindness instead of exposure. "They made my absence into a project." Naomi put her glasses back on. "Arthur made Damon part of the flower route. And me? He left you alone. That note doesn't look like being left alone." "No," Naomi said. "It looks like a man reminding himself not to interfere." The distinction should have mattered. Graham did not want it to. He took his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out before Naomi could say more. The maintenance shed behind the garage had no heat, but it blocked the wind. Graham entered, closed the door, and sat on a low wooden bench beside a row of snow shovels. The roof creaked above him. A loose metal panel struck softly every time the wind shifted. He pressed both hands together until the cold from his gloves reached his palms. Anger had always been useful because it made decisions simple. Someone was wrong. Something needed to be corrected. A boundary had been crossed. But beneath the anger sat something less disciplined. Damon had seen him accurately, not after the loss, before it. Even then, Graham had known how to move toward danger for other people, and away from any place where he might be known too well. He had mistaken self-containment for strength, long before grief gave him an excuse. The door opened several minutes later. Graham looked up. Tully entered first. Diane stood behind him with one hand on the leash and a paper folder tucked beneath her arm. "He had a veterinary appointment," she said. "Lenora told me you were here." Graham nodded toward the folder. "His leg? Old injury, some stiffness, no new damage. The vet recommended shorter walks when the temperature drops." Tully stepped farther inside. Diane looked from Graham to the closed shed door. "Do you need anything?" "No." She studied him long enough to show she did not believe him, then unclipped Tully's leash. "I have to bring the paperwork to Evelyn. He knows the way back to the house, but he seems to have decided this is a stop." Tully remained. Diane did not force him to leave. "I'll tell Mom where he is." She closed the door behind her. The dog stood in the center of the shed. Graham expected Tully to come closer, smell his gloves, or place his head against a knee in the way sentimental stories imagined dogs always understood sorrow. Tully did none of those things. He walked to the doorway, turned in a small circle, and lay down with his back toward the exit. His head remained pointed toward Graham. He had positioned himself between the bench and the door, not asking, not comforting, keeping watch. The restraint loosened something in Graham more effectively than affection might have. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "I left him there." Tully's bent ear shifted. Graham looked at the floor. There were civilians trapped in the lower structure. Damon volunteered to stay with the extraction team. The words sounded clinical at first, carried by the language he had used in reports. "We had one aircraft window left. I was ordered out with the others." The metal panel struck the roof again. "I argued once." He had remembered that argument as larger than it was. In truth, it lasted less than a minute. Damon had told him to go. The team leader had repeated the order. Graham had boarded. The aircraft lifted. Damon did not. "He knew what he was choosing," Graham said. "I knew why the order was given." Tully remained still. "I did the right thing." The sentence had been spoken to him by commanders, therapists, teammates, and Damon's mother. Each time, Graham had nodded. Each time, part of him had answered that correct decision still left bodies behind. "I did the right thing," he repeated, "and I hated him for making it possible." That was the truth he had never spoken. Not that Damon stayed. Not that Graham left. He had hated Damon for being brave enough to remove Graham's choice, then hated himself for the anger. "I thought if I let my life become easier, it would mean his choice cost me nothing." Tully lowered his chin onto his paws. Graham's voice became quieter. "So I kept paying." No response came. No forgiveness entered the room. Only wind, cold wood, and a dog who had decided the doorway did not need to be left unguarded. After a while, Graham stood. Tully rose with him. They returned to the records shed together. Naomi was still at the table. She had moved Damon's card away from the edge and placed a blank sheet over it to protect it from dust. She did not ask Graham where he had gone. Tully settled near the wall. Graham removed the protective sheet. "I thought Arthur was trying to fix me." Naomi capped her fountain pen. "Arthur repaired hinges. People were not hinges." Graham looked at the note again. What did he think the flower would do? Nothing dramatic. Naomi folded her hands. He believed a closed door should sometimes remain closed, but he also believed leaving a light on outside it was not the same as trying to enter. Graham glanced toward Tully. The dog's back rested against the wall, one ear aimed toward the room and one toward the door. Naomi continued. Arthur never believed he saved anyone with a flower. He left small choices where people could reach them. And if they didn't? He left them there anyway. Graham slid Damon's card carefully back into its sleeve. He did not ask to keep it. That mattered too. The card belonged to the archive, not to his need. Before they finished for the day, Naomi opened the metal flower cabinet near the administration hallway. Several white blooms stood in narrow water tubes, prepared for the accessible roots. Graham selected one. Naomi did not ask which grave it was for. Tully walked beside him as far as the Navy section, then stopped near the public path. His veterinary visit had been enough for one day. Graham continued alone. The sun was already lowering behind the western ridge. Light passed between the trees and lay across the snow in long golden bands. Damon's grave waited 6 rows beyond the memorial wall. Graham did not pause by the cottonwoods. He did not stand at the edge of the section and measure the distance. He walked directly to the marker. The small flag from his previous visit remained in place. Evelyn's older flower had been removed according to the cemetery schedule, leaving a shallow impression in the snow. Graham placed the fresh bloom beside Damon's name. Then he sat on the low stone border. For several minutes, he said nothing. That silence was different from the old one. It did not conceal him. "I found out you talked too much," Graham said at last. The corner of his mouth moved. "Apparently, even to groundskeepers." Wind stirred the flag. Graham looked across the quiet rows. "I'm still angry." He allowed the words to remain without correcting them. "But I came closer." Near the public path, Tully waited with Naomi, his dark shape outlined against the snow. Graham rested one bare hand on the cold top of Damon's marker. This time, he did not ask the flower to speak for him. High Meadow's annual winter memorial had been scheduled months before the county marked the North Slope in red. The ceremony was never large. Families gathered near the memorial wall. Volunteers cleared a narrow path through the snow. Names were read beneath a flag that usually snapped hard in the January wind, and afterward people carried coffee into the community hall across the road. Lenora had already ordered folding chairs. Naomi had prepared a small display from Arthur's archive. Miles had volunteered to supervise refreshments, which mostly meant telling everyone else how coffee ought to be made, while refusing to measure anything. Then the weather changed. The storm warning arrived 4 days before the ceremony. By the following morning, the forecast called for heavy snow, strong crosswinds, and visibility dropping below a quarter mile by late afternoon. Calvin's monitoring equipment also showed additional movement along the closed north slope after a brief thaw. The outdoor portion could not proceed. Lenora called Graham while he was replacing a cracked battery housing at the mountain rescue workshop. "We're canceling access to the grounds after noon Saturday," she said. "The hall can still open if the road stays clear, but no one goes beyond the green zone." Graham held the phone between his shoulder and ear while tightening a fastener. "What about the Navy section?" "Technically accessible, practically unsafe once the wind begins. We could use the tracked utility vehicle. Small groups, 5 minutes each." "No." Calvin hasn't even looked at the route yet. Calvin is standing in my office. A second voice came through the phone. I looked. Graham stopped turning the wrench. Calvin continued, calm as ever. The vehicle can handle snow. It cannot correct for zero visibility, elderly passengers, or ice hidden beneath fresh accumulation. We'd keep it inside the green zone. And if the vehicle stalls, it won't. That is not an emergency plan. Graham lowered the wrench. 2 months earlier, he would have continued the argument until the other person either surrendered or hung up. He looked at the open battery housing on the workbench. A good repair did not deny limits. It accounted for them. What if the ceremony moves? He asked. Lenora paused. Moves where? The hall. The families came to visit graves. They came to remember people. Silence followed. Then Calvin said, The hall has a generator? Backup unit, Graham answered. Old, but serviceable. How many exits? 3. Parking capacity? Lenora replied this time. Enough if we use the church overflow lot. Graham set the wrench down. We don't cancel the names. We bring them inside. By that afternoon, the memorial had become a different event. Not a replacement, Lenora insisted, an adaptation. The distinction mattered to her because families had entrusted the cemetery with more than land. They had trusted it with ritual, and rituals could not simply be rearranged because a practical man found a room with chairs. Naomi proposed grouping Arthur's verified cards by cemetery section. Families could stand at the corresponding table, place a flower beside the name, and share a memory if they wished. No one would be required to speak. No card containing unverified personal details would be displayed. Any family that had requested privacy would be represented by name only. Lenora handled permissions and attendance. Calvin inspected the community hall, the overflow parking area, and the route between them. He marked the safest pedestrian line with blue flags and arranged for the county plow to pass an hour before the doors opened. Graham tested the backup generator, replaced a brittle fuel hose, checked every emergency light, and distributed 4 radios among the volunteers. Miles recruited 6 retired veterans with the promise of coffee, folding chairs, and the rare opportunity to receive orders from civilians without consequences. No one believed that was the real reason they came. On Saturday morning, snow began falling before sunrise. By noon, the sky had lowered until the ridge beyond High Meadow disappeared completely. The cemetery gates remained closed except to staff. Across the road, warm light filled the windows of the community hall. Inside, Naomi arranged the memorial cards on long tables covered with plain white cloth. Each section had a small wooden marker matching the cemetery maps. White flowers stood in narrow glass jars at the center of every table. There were no dramatic photographs enlarged for display. No music played loudly enough to instruct people how to feel. Arthur's cards did most of the work. A retired Army mechanic who had restored toy trains, a Navy nurse who collected jazz records, a Marine who had baked terrible pies every Thanksgiving and refused all criticism. Near the western wall, one card contained only a name, service dates, and Arthur's handwritten line. No family information available. Let the name be enough for today. Graham stopped in front of it. Naomi was adjusting a stack of blank memory cards nearby. You kept that sentence, he said. It was accurate. Some people might find it sad. Naomi looked at the card. It is sad. She placed a pencil beside the blank cards. Accuracy is not required to be comforting. The first families arrived shortly after 2. Snow clung to coats, hats, and the shoulders of people who had crossed only 30 yards from the parking lot. Volunteers took wet umbrellas and offered towels for boots. An elderly couple from Helena had driven in the previous night to avoid the storm. A former Air Force pilot arrived using a walker fitted with small ice grips. Two sisters stood together at this Navy table, each carrying a different photograph of the same man. Some visitors entered quietly. Others spoke too loudly because silence felt dangerous. Miles stood behind the refreshment table wearing his brick-red jacket and a paper name tag that read, "Coffee Command." At 3:15, he knocked over half a pot. The dark liquid spread across one corner of Calvin's parking map. Miles stared down at it. Calvin stared at him. "This," Miles announced, "appears to be a deliberate Navy assault on Army infrastructure." "You served in Army fire protection," Calvin said. "I contain multi-branch resentment." Graham handed him a towel. "Your command is leaking." Several people nearby laughed. The sound did not disturb the ceremony. It loosened the room. That mattered. Evelyn arrived with Diane shortly before the name reading began. Diane had checked the road twice with Lenora, and once with Calvin before agreeing to bring her. Evelyn wore a camel-colored winter coat, a cream hat, and the silver pine branch brooch Arthur had given her years earlier. Tully walked beside them on a leash. The old Navy scarf was tied loosely around his neck. He looked displeased by the arrangement, pausing twice to shake his head, as though hoping the scarf might reconsider its attachment. Evelyn leaned toward Graham. "He believes dignity is incompatible with accessories." "He may be right. He usually assumes so." Tully greeted no one dramatically. He smelled Miles's coat because Miles kept beef treats in one pocket. He stood near Evelyn's chair during the opening remarks, and moved away when two children from a visiting family became excited near the refreshment table. The gathering remained imperfect. A veteran reading his friend's name gave the wrong enlistment year. 3 men corrected him simultaneously. The reader glared at them and said, "This is why none of you were invited to my retirement speech." At the Eastern table, a woman began describing her brother's obsession with rebuilding radios, then forgot the name of the town where he opened his first shop. Her cousin supplied the answer from the back row. Another visitor cried halfway through a memory about his wife burning biscuits. He laughed while wiping his face. No one told him to choose one response. The room held both. At each table, a volunteer read a name. Someone who knew the person could share a detail. If no one spoke, the name was repeated once, and a white flower was placed beside the card. There was no attempt to turn every life into a lesson. Some memories were generous, some were embarrassing. Some were so ordinary that Graham understood exactly why they had survived. A woman remembered the sound of her father cleaning snow from his boots. A man remembered his friend refusing to buy expensive mustard. Someone remembered a voice singing badly in the garage. The dead became less ceremonial with each story. More difficult, more alive. Graham stood near the Navy table, monitoring one of the radios clipped to his belt. He had agreed to help with equipment and crowd flow. Nothing else. Naomi approached with the blue section list in her hand. "Damon Pike is next." Graham looked toward the card. "I know. Would you like to read the name?" "No." Naomi did not react. "Would you like someone else to?" "Yes." Nodded and returned to the table. The absence of pressure left him nowhere to direct his resistance. A retired chief petty officer read Damon's full name and service dates. The room quieted. Naomi invited anyone who wished to share a memory. Graham remained where he was. He could feel Evelyn looking toward him, though she did not speak. Diane kept her attention on Tully's leash. Miles suddenly became very interested in the coffee cups. No one moved to rescue Graham from the choice. That, more than encouragement, made the moment difficult. A volunteer lifted one of the white flowers and placed it inside a waxed cloth carrier. Tully had been helping move flowers between the preparation table and the section displays under Diane's supervision. The aisle to the Navy table was partly blocked by several guests adjusting their chairs. Tully approached, stopped, and looked for another path. There was none wide enough. He lowered the carrier beside the nearest pair of boots. Graham's boots. The dog did not look up at him with symbolic wisdom. He turned toward Diane, waiting for another instruction. A few people smiled at the accident. Graham looked down at the white flower. Nothing in the moment demanded heroism. The room would continue without him. Damon's name had already been read. A flower would be placed. No one would accuse Graham of failure if he stayed silent. That was why he finally moved. He unclipped the radio from his belt and handed it to Calvin. "I need a minute." Calvin took it without comment. Graham carried the flower to the Navy table. Naomi stepped aside. He stood behind the card and looked at the people gathered before him. He had spoken to teams under pressure, delivered briefings, given instructions when every second mattered. This felt less manageable. "My name is Graham Voss," he said. "Damon Pike was my friend." The word friend nearly stopped him. Not teammate, not colleague, not fallen service member. Friend. Graham looked at the card. "I could tell you how he died." Several faces lifted. "But that isn't the story I want to give you." He rested one hand against the edge of the table. Damon once spent 53 minutes trying to free a raccoon from an industrial trash container. The room shifted. Miles lowered his cup. "It was not trapped," Graham continued. "It had climbed in after food and became too angry to climb back out." A few people laughed. Damon found a maintenance ladder. The raccoon tried to bite the ladder, then it tried to bite Damon. Then it climbed onto his shoulder and remained there long enough for the entire team to see. The laughter grew. Graham could see their scene again. Damon standing beside the dumpster with one sleeve torn, insisting the animal had shown professional gratitude. "He made every one of us swear we would never tell the story." Graham paused. He believed it would damage his reputation. A retired sailor near the front said, "It has." The room laughed again. Graham did too. The sound surprised him. It did not feel like disloyalty. It felt like Damon had briefly entered the hall and found the whole situation ridiculous. Graham looked down at the flower. He did kind things when no one important was watching. His voice tightened. He stayed late. He called his mother. He fixed equipment that wasn't his responsibility. He made coffee no reasonable person should have consumed. The room became quiet without losing its warmth. For a long time, I remembered only the last decision he made. Graham touched the card with 2 fingers. That was not the whole man. He placed the white flower beside Damon's name. This time, the room did not applaud. Graham was grateful. Naomi read the next name. The ceremony continued. Outside, the storm erased the cemetery road and pressed snow against the lower windows of the hall. Inside, people carried names from table to table. They told stories, corrected dates, poured coffee, lost their place, and began again. By early evening, the parking lot had been cleared twice. Calvin recommended ending before visibility worsened further. Volunteers helped visitors into vehicles in small groups. Diane brought Evelyn's coat. Tully had fallen asleep beneath her chair, with Arthur's scarf twisted sideways around his neck. Lenora entered from the office alcove holding her phone and a printed county notice. Her expression told Graham the news before she spoke. "The monitoring report is final," she said. "The north section remains closed until at least April." No one answered immediately. 3 months. 3 months without the old routes. 3 months in which names tied to those sections could no longer receive flowers where Arthur had placed them. Evelyn looked around the hall. The tables were untidy now. Several jars were empty. Memory cards covered one section where visitors had added stories Naomi had not previously recorded. A coffee stain darkened Calvin's map. Miles was attempting to remove it with a method that seemed likely to destroy both paper and tablecloth. Evelyn rested both hands on the head of her cane. "Good," she said. Diane stared at her. "Good? We have 3 months." "For what?" Evelyn looked at Graham, then Naomi, Lenora, Calvin, Miles, and finally Tully, sleeping beneath the chair. "To stop doing this in a way that depends on one old woman and one dog." Outside, the names remained beneath snow and stone. Inside, for the first time, they belonged to more than one keeper. The morning after the winter memorial, the community hall looked less like a place where something important had happened, and more like a room that needed cleaning. Half-empty coffee cups stood on windowsills. Wet footprints had dried into pale salt marks across the floor. Several white flowers leaned inside their jars, and one of Calvin's parking maps remained beneath a brown stain Miles had failed to remove with 3 paper towels and what he called controlled optimism. No one proposed forming an organization. There was no vote, no polished mission statement, and no photograph of the group standing together beneath a banner. They began with one wall. Lenora approved the use of this hall's eastern side for a temporary memorial display, while the northern cemetery section remained closed. Naomi mounted copies of verified cards on simple cream-colored boards, leaving enough space between them that visitors could stop without blocking one another. The original archive remained secured. Only information families had already approved for public use appeared on the wall. Where there was no personal story, Naomi displayed the name, service branch, and dates without trying to manufacture meaning. White flowers intended for the closed roots were placed beneath the corresponding names. Evelyn continued selecting the names from Arthur's ledger. The arrangement was imperfect, but it gave the winter somewhere to put its promises. The second idea came from Miles. He presented it during a meeting at the hall with his coat still on and a powdered donut leaving evidence across his mustache. "We've spent a great deal of effort making sure dead people aren't alone," he said. "Some of the living are doing worse." Lenora looked across the table. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Visits, coffee, maybe groceries, minor repairs." Graham folded his arms. "Who decides who gets visited?" Miles pointed toward him with the donut. "That is why I brought the idea here instead of driving randomly around town bothering widows." "You would enjoy that too much," Evelyn said. Miles considered this. "Fair." The first version of his plan lasted less than 15 minutes. Then Dr. Maribel Shaw arrived. She had spent more than 20 years as a social worker within the Regional Veterans Network before moving into part-time program coordination. Her silver curls framed a calm, rounded face, and her gold-rimmed glasses rested low enough that she could look over them whenever someone confused enthusiasm with competence. She listened while Miles explained. When he finished, Maribel opened a plum-colored notebook. "No," Miles blinked. "No to visits?" No to uninvited visits. Informal lists of lonely people, volunteers entering homes without training, and the assumption that wanting to help grants access to another person's private life." The room quieted. Graham liked her immediately, not because she agreed with him. She did not. He had already begun listing people he thought might benefit from the project, based on observations at the cemetery. Maribel crossed out the entire page. "You do not get to identify someone as lonely because they sit alone," she told him. "They come to the cemetery every day. That makes them regular visitors. It does not make them available for rescue." The word rescue landed where she intended. Graham leaned back. Maribel continued. "People could register themselves through the Veterans Center, senior services, or participating families. Referrals required consent. Volunteers would work in pairs. Every visit needed an agreed time and purpose. No photographs without permission. No recording personal stories for the memorial archive unless the person made a separate, informed choice. No entering bedrooms, handling medication, moving money, or pretending a social visit could replace medical or mental health care. If someone needs professional support, Maribel said, you refer them. You do not become the entire support system because it makes you feel useful. Miles looked toward Graham. Graham ignored him. The pilot began with 6 participants. 3 requested brief visits. 2 wanted help with practical tasks. 1 asked only for weekly phone calls. They divided the work into 2 routes. The first remained connected to High Meadow. Naomi maintained the memorial wall, Evelyn selected names, and volunteers delivered flowers to the hall rather than the closed cemetery sections. The second route moved outward into the community. It did not always involve flowers. That had been Evelyn's suggestion. A flower is an offering, she said. It is not a universal answer. Some people wanted coffee. Some wanted help changing furnace filters. One man asked for someone to sit with his wife while he attended a medical appointment. Maribel redirected that request to a licensed respite program rather than allowing the volunteers to improvise. Graham took on too much almost immediately. He checked the hall generator every Monday. He repaired 2 folding tables, replaced an emergency light, updated the radio batteries, drove Evelyn to Naomi's archive sessions, took Tully to a follow-up appointment, and volunteered for 4 of the first 6 visits. He also continued his regular work at the rescue equipment shop. For 3 weeks, he slept in short sections and told anyone who asked that he was fine. The lie was not convincing, but it was efficient. Tully began staying at Graham's house on the nights Evelyn remained with Diane during storms. The first evening, the dog refused the blanket Graham placed in the living room. Tully slept beside the back door instead, body curved toward the threshold. At 2 a.m, Graham found him awake. You know she isn't coming through that door tonight. Tully looked at him. Graham sat on the floor a few feet away. The house was quiet except for the heating system and the faint rattle of ice against the window. He did not try to call the dog closer. After several minutes, Tully lowered his head again. By the 4th overnight stay, the dog slept halfway between the door and the kitchen. It was not trust exactly. It was geography changing by degrees. Tully still returned to the old groundskeeper's house whenever he could. One afternoon, Graham found him lying in front of Arthur's coat, which remained hanging near the entry. Tully had placed his nose beneath the lower edge, where the wool still carried traces of cedar, cold air, and the man who once wore it. Evelyn sat nearby. She did not call him away. Graham stood in the doorway. How long has he been there? An hour. Should we move the coat? No. He's waiting. Yes. Evelyn lowered herself into the chair beside the wall. So am I some days. She rested one hand on Tully's back. We do not have to cure every form of waiting. Graham sat across from them. Nothing was solved. That was becoming less frightening. Tully's acceptance of the new routes developed for less poetic reasons. Miles carried beef treats. Naomi allowed him to smell each new cloth marker before fastening it to the carriers. Maribel insisted that he remain home during visits involving people uncomfortable with large dogs. Tully did not become the official mascot of anything. Some days he participated. Some days he slept near Evelyn. Some days his leg hurt, and Graham shortened the walk. The project grew slowly enough that its weaknesses became visible. That should have reassured Graham. Instead, he tried to compensate for every gap himself. The breaking point involved a flower cart. Miles had found an old metal utility trolley in the hall basement and replaced one damaged wheel. Graham noticed it leaning in the storage room after a 14-hour day. The new wheel had been mounted backward. You installed the bracket on the wrong side. Miles looked up from a box of paper cups. It rolls. It pulls left. Then walks slightly right. Graham crouched beside the cart. The bearing is going to wear unevenly. It is carrying flowers, not artillery. That doesn't make bad work acceptable. Miles stared at him. The room became quiet. Graham removed the wrench from his belt and began loosening the bracket. Miles waited until he had turned the second bolt. You missed Evelyn's archive meeting yesterday. I was working. You volunteered to drive her. Diane took her. Because you forgot. Graham stopped. Miles leaned against the storage shelf. You also signed up for 2 visits tomorrow, checked the generator twice this week, and offered to rebuild the rear ramp even though Calvin already approved it. It needs reinforcement. It needs you to stop looking for places to bleed. Graham stood. What does that mean? Miles's usual humor had left his face. You are turning kindness into another way to punish yourself. Graham looked toward the cart. Miles continued before he could interrupt. If this thing only works when you do not sleep, refuse help, and make everyone nervous about touching a wrench, you are not building a program. He pointed at the backward wheel. You are building an accident. Graham did not answer. The accusation felt unfair because it described him accurately. He had replaced the mission with a route, the team with a list, and danger with exhaustion. The method had changed. The instinct had not. He wanted every person visited, every flower delivered, every machine repaired, every promise kept. Not because he alone was qualified, because if the work became heavy enough, he did not have to notice that his life was becoming larger around it. Miles picked up the wrench Graham had placed on the shelf. Now, are you going to show me how to install this correctly? Or stand there looking like I insulted your ancestors? Graham exhaled. Both. They remounted the wheel together. 2 days later, the responsibility chart appeared on the hall wall. Naomi managed archive records and permissions. Lenora controlled cemetery access and event schedules. Calvin reviewed safe routes and building changes. Maribel trained volunteers and handled referrals. Miles coordinated drivers and visit pairs. Evelyn retained authority over Arthur's ledger and the principles used to select names. Graham was assigned equipment, logistics, and 2 field routes per week. His name did not appear in every column. He disliked that for nearly an hour. Then he slept through the night. Evelyn's move developed with similar caution. She did not leave the groundskeeper's house all at once. She spent 1 storm week with Diane, then returned when the roads cleared. Later, she tried an independent living apartment near Missoula for 12 days. The apartment had a shared courtyard, wide doorways, and enough room for Tully to visit without overturning furniture. Evelyn inspected the emergency call system, complained about the weak coffee in the dining room, and negotiated permission to keep Arthur's ledger in a locked cabinet. She did not agree to move permanently. Not yet. The choice remained hers. Graham's most useful visit that winter occurred in late February. He and Miles drove to the home of Walter Ames, a 79-year-old Air Force veteran who had registered through the Senior Services Office. Walter had selected minor equipment help on the form. He opened the door wearing a gray cardigan and an expression suggesting he already regretted the appointment. I don't want flowers, he said. Miles held up both hands. Excellent, I forgot them. Walter looked at Graham. My radio loses the game every time I turn the volume past 12. The radio sat on a small table beside the recliner. It was an older digital model with a loose power jack and a cracked antenna connection. Graham opened the back panel. Walter watched from his chair. He did not tell them about military service, grief, estranged relatives, or the meaning of the framed photograph on the shelf. Graham did not ask. He cleaned the contact, secured the jack, and replaced the damaged antenna lead with one from his repair kit. The radio came back to life in the middle of a college basketball game. Walter increased the volume to 13. The signal held. "That'll do," he said. Miles stood. Walter looked toward the television, then at the radio. "First half has 6 minutes left." Graham waited. Walter cleared his throat. "You can stay if you know how to be quiet during free throws." Miles sat immediately. Graham remained standing for 1 second longer. Then he took the chair beside the window. No one discussed loneliness. Walter complained about the officials. Miles argued with him. Graham watched the last 6 minutes of the half. When he returned home, Tully was asleep in the kitchen rather than beside the door. The phone rang before Graham removed his coat. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he saw the Wyoming number. Damon's mother said his name when he answered. Her voice had aged, but he recognized it immediately. She told him the family planned to gather in April. Nothing formal. Food, old photographs, too many stories repeated by people who no longer remembered which parts were true. "We would like you there," she said. Graham looked toward Tully. The dog had lifted his head. In previous years, Graham would have mentioned work, weather, or uncertainty about his schedule. The excuses arrived out of habit. He let them pass. "I'll come," he said. The words were simple. So was the silence that followed. But it was the first promise to Damon's family Graham had made, without already preparing the reason he might break it. By the first week of April, winter had begun loosening its hold on High Meadow. Snow still lay in long, white strips between the rows of markers, but the roads no longer disappeared beneath fresh storms every night. Water moved through the drainage channels beside the paths, carrying pine needles and fragments of ice downhill in thin, bright streams. The morning sun had warmth in it again. Not much. Enough for birds to return to the upper branches of the lodgepole pines and argue noisily over territory they had abandoned all winter. Calvin Rusk removed the final section of orange barrier from the northern access road shortly after 8. He did not declare the area fully repaired. That would take another season of monitoring. The retaining layer had been reinforced, drainage channels widened, and the worst section of raised pavement replaced. One section remained marked yellow, restricted to staff and maintenance crews. The rest could reopen under controlled access. Lenora stood beside him with the route map in hand. "No shortcuts," she told the volunteers gathered near the maintenance building. "No stepping beyond the blue markers. No one enters the yellow area because a flower would look better on the other side." Miles raised his hand. "What if the flower has very strong opinions?" Lenora looked at him. "Then it can file a written appeal." Several volunteers laughed. The sound traveled easily through the clear morning air. Graham stood near his truck with Tully beside him. The German shepherd's coat had thickened through winter, though silver now showed more clearly around his muzzle. Moist spring air made the old injury in his rear leg stiff, and his first few steps after leaving the truck had been slow. Graham had noticed. He always noticed now. But he no longer treated noticing as an instruction to take control. He waited while Tully stretched, shook himself, and decided when he was ready to move. Across the parking area, Diane helped Evelyn from her vehicle. Evelyn wore her camel-colored coat despite the warming day. The silver pine brooch remained pinned near the collar, and both hands rested on the handles of a graphite walker fitted with larger outdoor wheels. She had argued against bringing it. Diane had argued back. The compromise was that Evelyn used it without pretending to enjoy doing so. "You look disappointed," Graham said when she reached him. "I was hoping the cemetery would have become less uphill while I was gone. You should speak to Calvin. I intend to blame him personally." Calvin heard her. "That is outside my authority, Mrs. Crow. Convenient. Evelyn now spent most nights in the independent living apartment near Diane. The move had not happened in one decisive act. For several weeks, she had stayed there during storms, returned to the groundskeeper's house when roads cleared, then gone back again for medical appointments and meals with Diane. Eventually, the apartment began holding more of her clothes. The old house began holding fewer of them. There had been no moment when one place stopped being home and the other became it. Life did not always respect clean transitions. Evelyn and Diane had spent the final weeks of March sorting Arthur's belongings one shelf at a time. Some tools went to the cemetery workshop. Several coats were donated. His boots remained beside the old door because neither woman was ready to decide what should happen to them. The storage room behind the house had been converted into a small workspace for the white flower route. Copies of Naomi's verified cards sat in labeled boxes. The cloth carriers hung from their original hooks. Clean jars, waxed sleeves, and route maps filled a new set of shelves Graham had built. Evelyn retained the key. That had been non-negotiable. Tully had also changed homes without a single clear dividing day. He still stayed with Evelyn when the weather allowed, and spent afternoons in the apartment courtyard, where several residents had learned the exact location of Miles's hidden treat supply. But the apartment was not suited to a large shepherd full-time. The hallways were narrow. The shared garden had strict leash rules. Tully became restless when elevators closed around him. One evening in late March, Evelyn had sat at Graham's kitchen table while Tully slept near the refrigerator. She had placed the veterinary folder between them. "I want you to become his primary caregiver." Graham had looked at the folder, then at her. "Are you sure?" "No. Certainty is mostly a luxury enjoyed by people who do not understand what they are deciding." She rested both hands around her coffee mug. "I know he settles here. I know you understand his leg. I know you do not force him into rooms he does not want to enter." Tully opened one eye, then closed it again. Evelyn continued. "He spent most of his life making sure no one was left behind. Perhaps he should live with someone learning the same lesson." Graham had not answered immediately. He did not want Tully to become a reward for improvement, or proof that grief had selected him for a new purpose. "He still sees you," Graham said, "frequently." "And the house." "As long as I control the key." That settled it. The paperwork listed Graham as primary caregiver and Evelyn as co-owner. Diane remained the secondary emergency contact. Nothing about the arrangement erased Arthur. It simply acknowledged where Tully had begun sleeping when no one told him where he belonged. Now, on the first morning the north section reopened, Evelyn removed an old waxed cloth carrier from the root box. The fabric had softened at the folds. A round pine marker hung from its cord. She placed one white flower inside. Tully smelled the carrier. His bent ear shifted. Then he took the handle gently between his teeth. The group did not follow in a ceremonial line. Lenora walked ahead to check the marked path. Calvin remained near the repaired section, inspecting drainage. Naomi carried a folder of updated cards. Miles pushed the flower cart, which now rolled straight after Graham had taught him how to mount the wheel properly. Diane stayed beside Evelyn. Graham walked several paces behind Tully. The dog chose his own speed. At the first incline, his rear leg stiffened. He stopped, shifted his weight, and looked toward the path ahead. No one encouraged him. No one called his name. After a moment, Tully continued. Arthur Crow's grave lay near the edge of the old groundskeeper's section, beneath a cottonwood that had not yet grown new leaves. A shallow tray stood near the path. Tully approached it, lowered his head, and released the carrier. The flower rested against the dark metal. He sat. Wind moved lightly through his coat. The group stopped behind him. For nearly a minute, Tully watched the grave. Then he rose and turned away. He did not remain beside the stone. He went directly to Evelyn. She lowered one hand from the walker. Tully placed his head beneath it, pressing his forehead gently against her palm. Evelyn's fingers moved over the bent tip of his ear. "Well," she said, looking down at Arthur's name, "you would be furious." Miles removed his hat. "At what?" "Forms, meetings, training sessions." He would add another page. "For what?" Miles considered. "Coffee accountability." Evelyn looked towards the cart. "You would fail inspection?" "That sounds like government overreach." The laughter that followed was quiet but real. Tully remained beside Evelyn. He did not look back toward the grave. Graham understood the change. Tully had completed the old route. He had not abandoned Arthur. He had simply returned to the person still standing. Naomi handed Graham a second white flower. No cloth carrier, no root marker, just the stem. Graham accepted it. Damon's grave remained in the Navy section, beyond the memorial wall and below the line of pines where Graham had once spent so much time standing at a distance. He walked there alone. Not because he needed privacy, because no one needed to carry him now. A thin layer of snow remained along the lower edge of the bronze marker. Graham removed his glove and brushed it aside. Damon Elias Pike. The small flag had been replaced for spring. Graham placed the flower beside it. He had gone to Wyoming 2 weeks earlier for the Pike family gathering. Damon's mother had opened the door before he reached the porch. She was smaller than Graham remembered, her gray hair cut short, and her hand still surprisingly strong when she held his. No one asked him to explain why he had stayed away. That mercy had nearly undone him. The gathering had not been solemn. There were too many relatives, too much food, and several competing versions of Damon's life. His mother served coffee containing so much sugar that Graham understood the habit had been inherited rather than developed. An older cousin told the story of Damon wrecking his first truck. Damon had claimed a deer stepped into the road. The damage appeared on the passenger side, while the vehicle had been parked behind a feed store. No deer had been found. No one had ever explained how a stationary truck had been struck by imaginary wildlife. Graham had laughed with the family. Later, Damon's mother gave him a photograph of Damon at 19, leaning against the damaged truck with one hand covering a dent and an expression of extreme innocence. Graham carried the photograph inside his jacket now. He did not remove it. He rested his bare hand on the marker. "I went to see your mother." The words came more easily than they once had. "She still makes your coffee wrong." Wind moved through the small flag. "She told me about the deer." Graham looked down at the white flower. For years, he had believed pain was evidence. If the grief remained sharp, then Damon remained important. If Graham allowed himself peace, perhaps it would mean the debt had been forgiven without payment. He saw now how closely guilt resembled loyalty when carried long enough. "I thought healing meant leaving you behind," he said. The cemetery remained quiet. "It doesn't." He did not need Damon to answer. Graham looked across the rows toward the repaired northern path. Volunteers moved between the markers with flowers and route cards. Naomi stood near the storage room, checking a source date with Lenora. Calvin had crouched beside a drainage channel to inspect the flow of meltwater. Miles poured coffee for 2 visitors, ignoring the written sign asking volunteers not to handle refreshments until the tables had been arranged. Diane and Evelyn waited with Tully near Arthur's grave. Every person was doing a small part. No one was carrying the whole place. Graham returned his attention to Damon. "I kept the pain because I thought it was the last thing we still shared." He paused. "But you left more than that." The raccoon story, the terrible coffee, Sunday calls to his mother, the patience to help strangers when no one important was watching. A sentence spoken years ago to a groundskeeper about a friend who did not know how to leave bad places. Graham had spent too long treating Damon's death as the final definition of his life. Now he understood memory could continue without remaining frozen. It could change hands. That was not betrayal. It was continuation. Graham rose slowly. He left the flower beside the grave. This time, no one else had placed it for him. By late morning, the volunteers had divided into their assigned routes. One pair carried flowers toward the reopened western cluster. Another loaded supplies for visits arranged through Maribel's program. Naomi returned to the archive to finish verifying several new family notes. Lenora checked the afternoon burial schedule. Calvin walked the blue-marked path, adding 2 monitoring flags where meltwater had softened the shoulder. Miles remained in charge of coffee, despite the absence of any official decision granting him that responsibility. Evelyn watched from the old porch while Diane moved boxes inside the storage room. Arthur's boots still stood near the door. No one mentioned them. Graham crossed the cemetery with Tully beside him. The dog carried nothing. No flower, no cloth tube. No marker belonging to a route Arthur had built. For the first time since Graham had seen him in the snow, Tully was simply walking. His old leg made the stride uneven, but the rhythm no longer sounded lonely. Near the central path, Graham looked back. Footprints crossed the remaining snow in several directions. Some belonged to volunteers, some to families, some to Tully. The sun had already softened their edges. By afternoon, many would disappear. Once, Graham would have considered that a loss. He understood differently now. Footprints did not have to last forever. They only had to remain long enough for another person to see where the ground was safe. Evelyn called from the porch. "If you two intend to stand there all morning, Miles will finish the coffee." "That may be a public safety issue," Graham said. Tully turned toward her voice. Together they walked toward the old house. Evelyn waited beneath the porch light Graham had repaired at the beginning of winter. Diane stood behind her with one archive box in her arms. Miles had already placed 3 cups on the table, though no one had asked him to. Behind them, the white rose of High Meadow shone beneath the clear spring sun. The cemetery had not become less sad. Arthur remained gone. Damon remained gone. Every name beneath the snow still belonged to a life that could not be restored. But grief no longer owned the only road through the place. There were other paths now, paths toward memory, toward service, toward a kitchen where someone had poured too much coffee, toward a living person who might still answer when called. Graham rested one hand briefly against Tully's shoulder. The dog leaned into it, then continued forward. And where a name was still spoken, loss had not won the final word. Some losses never become small, but they can become lighter when they are carried by more than one heart. Graham learned that remembering Damon did not require him to remain frozen beside the worst day of their lives. Evelyn learned that letting others continue Arthur's work did not mean letting Arthur go. And Tully showed them both that loyalty is not always staying in the same place. Sometimes it is knowing when to turn back toward the living. Perhaps there is a name you still speak quietly, a chair you still notice, or a memory you have carried alone for too long. May God give you the grace to remember with love, without believing you must suffer forever to prove that love was real. Share in the comments the name or memory you would like to keep alive. And if stories of loyalty, healing, and quiet hope matter to you, Please subscribe and join us for the next one. May peace find its way to your door.